Hi everyone, welcome to week 4 to your lecture on political globalization. I hope you're all doing good and I hope you had a good week and are keeping warm with this cold weather. Before we start looking at different topics within political globalization, quick admin reminder as usual. All content will be available on Learn and Moodle as usual. The access to this lecture, but also to the slides and to the online activity. Please be aware of assignment number 1 that is due next week, Thursday, on the 10th September before midnight. All information is on Learn and on Moodle. You can access it under assessments. I've also sent announcements, so you should also find it in your emails. Please make sure you start with it early, and please also make sure that you don't submit last minute, because the online submission can get jammed last minute if everybody is submitting 2 minutes before midnight. So please take time. Please take time to really read the indications and all the advice properly. I'm also going to take you through it at the end of this lecture. That's really going to help you to actually deliver what you're expected to deliver. Okay, this is usually a sit-in, an in-class exam. It's a take-home exam because of Corona. So because you have more time to work on it, the bar is also higher than what it would be because you do have access to all the resources. So make sure you dedicate enough time to really submit something of good quality. And as usual as well, it is your responsibility to manage your time responsibly and to stay up to date with the weekly online lectures and activities. If you started late into the semester due to whatever personal reasons, make sure you catch up as soon as possible so that it doesn't become an unworkable load. That just as a recommendation. Email me, get in touch if you have any type of issues, struggles, doubts, whatever. Okay, so we're getting started with today. We're talking political globalization. So we're first going to look at some of the main global political structures. We're going to look at the nation state, of its role and development, and also how it is evolving and what that means for our world, basically. We're obviously looking at the United Nations because it's pretty much the main global political structure. We're also going to specifically look at the African Union because obviously we're on the continent, and also with Cyril Ramaphosa being the chair, that's something additionally of interest. And we're also going to look at the role of universal human rights. It's not necessarily a political structure per se, but it is a treaty/agreement that almost all countries in the world have agreed to decades ago already, and where we also have global agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals that every country is to some extent integrating into their plans for development, right? So it is something that also can be considered a global political structure. We will then look at where is global governance headed. So how is globalization shaping politics, and what are we looking at in terms of global governance? And we'll also look at the role of civil society because it is also becoming a more and more important political actor. It always has been an important political actor, but much more on a local or national level. And now with globalization, the role of civil society is also becoming more and more globalized, and we're seeing more global movements. And last but not least, as announced, a quick briefing on assignment 1 that is due on the 10th of September so that you feel ready for it. Now, before we get really started with the content that I just introduced, I would like you to ask yourself the following questions because they're very closely linked with political globalization and with how our world is structured politically. And the first question would be, how important is your nationality for you? To what extent do you feel that it defines your personal identity? To what extent you being South African or Zimbabwean or wherever you're from, To what extent does it define who you are? To what extent does your nationality also define how other people maybe see you, or how you're able to access the world or access globalization? Just take a moment to really ask yourself, how important is your nationality for you and for how you move or can move in this world? The next question would be, to what extent do you think the functioning of our current world is based on nation states? To what extent, to the right, you see a picture of the world without borders, like a geographical map, but we're more used to the other map with the countries and the borders. So to what extent is the functioning of our world based on nation states still? And how is that changing? Now, once you've given this a bit of a thought, we're gonna get started with political globalization. And the first thing we need to do is to really clearly define what we understand by nation state, because it's a term that we use very often, but we need to make sure that we're actually talking about the same, right? Nation state is really sort of the correct term of what we usually in our daily lives call country. But a country is not a very defined concept, which is why in international studies we talk about a nation state, because it is a very clearly defined concept that we're going to look at now before we get going into how the nation state has changed and developed, right? So when we talk about nation state, you can already see the two words, nation and state, right? So let's look at each concept and then at what they mean together. Now, when we talk of state, the state really refers to the organizational structure of a country. So it is based on the concepts of sovereignty, of political self-determination, and also of legal equality with other states. Remember that in lecture 1, we talked about the Treaty of Westphalia that sort of laid the ground for the concept of nation states. And where this concept of sovereignty was very fundamental, right? So this is really the understanding that different states recognize that they are independent, that they have sovereignty over their own territory, that they are politically independent and can determine themselves how they function within, and that they're legally equal with other states, and that they respect other states' sovereignty and political self-determination as well, right? So that's sort of the concept of state. Now, I'm sure you're already thinking of a lot of cases and examples where this is not applying, which is obviously true, but in theory, this is what a state is. Now, a nation, nation is the concept linked to the people, right? So a nation is usually a social group of people that is linked through common descent, culture, language, right? So it's almost this, Anderson calls it, and you can read more on this in your textbook, Anderson calls it an imagined community that exists mainly as a set of ideas in people's minds. But it's very closely linked to culture and language. So a nation is usually the social group. So it doesn't have anything to do with the structure, with the organizational structure, right? So if you look at these two, the state is really the structure. It's the sort of political structure, while the nation is sort of the community of people, or the feeling of community of people. Now, when we put those two together, we have a nation state, right? And a nation state is basically one nation or several nations that together build a state or build a nation state because they have the organizational structure of a state, right? So that's nation, one nation or several nations coming together and having an organizational structure. And with that, they build a nation state, right? That is then recognized by other countries. Remember what we said with the state, right? It's legal equality with other states. So that means being recognized by other states as well. Now, can you think of examples of nation states with only one nation? So only one social group. Can you think of nation states with several nations? Nations with no state, or nations that are spread over several states? And what are possible problems or conflicts of each of these combinations, right? If you look at the different options, none of them is very, like, all of them come with different packages, with different advantages and disadvantages, right? And we see examples of all of them around the world. For example, nation states with only one nation. It depends what you consider a nation, obviously, right? And here we can go into whole arguments and discussions. But basically, nation states with only one nation are, for example, one could argue countries like Italy or like Germany, Israel as well. So it depends, right? But there's actually not that many nation states that purely have only one nation. You could potentially count France as well. You could count Portugal, Austria. So there are nations that basically just have one sort of nation, one social group. However, with globalization, there's also sort of immigrated nations or groups of people that might be considered as a nation within the nation. So, for example, the Turkish population in Germany makes up quite a high amount of the population. So the question is, would we consider that a nation as well? And then Germany would not be a nation state with only one nation anymore, right? What do you do with Australia? You could say that they only have one nation, but what about the Aborigines, right? So it becomes very, very sort of, as soon as you analyze one case, it can become more complicated. Examples for nation states with several nations, that's a vast majority of nation states, right, that have several nations. Particularly African countries, because many borders on the African continent were drawn by the colonial powers, and they were literally drawn on a table somewhere in Europe. A lot of nations were divided, and now part of one nation is in one nation state and the other part of the nation is in another nation state. But also a lot of nations were thrown together into the same nation state, into the same country, right? So you have a lot of, but also countries like Spain, for example, that has the Catalan nation as well. They have the Basque nation. So you have a lot of nation states that have several nations within. And those nation states sometimes battle with separatist movements, right? Where one nation within the nation state says, no, we actually want to be independent. We want to be a nation state for ourselves. Cases here on the continent would be Nigeria, right? The Biafra War was a war of a nation trying to gain independence and be a nation state for itself, without success in that case. Now, if we look at nations with no state, that's a difficult one, right? Because imagine you are a nation, but you actually don't have a territory, because the state is the territory, it's the organizational structure, and it's also the legal recognition from other states, right? Example number one is obviously Palestine, right? That is a nation. They still have part of their original territory, but they're not internationally recognized as a nation state. And that comes with a lot of legal problems, because how do you defend yourself if you don't have a say? How are you part of international institutions if you're not a recognized nation state? Some international institutions allow for representation of Palestine, some don't, because they don't consider it a nation state. And now the last one, there's a fourth option, which is nations that are spread over several states, right? And there's many as well, particularly where, as mentioned before, where borders were drawn without sort of considering the local circumstances. You have nations that are spread over several states. A very sort of renowned case is the Kurdish nation, which is recognized as a nation, but is spread over a lot of different states. And we're going to look at it as a case study a bit further on. Now let's look at the role of the nation state and how it is evolving. As you remember in lecture 1, we looked at the Treaty of Westphalia and at sort of the birth of the nation state, right? So with the Treaty of Westphalia, several European nations came together after a long period of war to basically sign a treaty where they recognized each other as nation states and as sovereign nation states. So they basically acknowledged the sovereignty of the other nation states with that treaty. And this was really the birth of the nation state as a political structure and as the main political structure in Europe. And then in the following decades and centuries, imperialism and colonization basically took that nation state pretty much everywhere around the world. And the nation state became the prevalent organizational structure worldwide, right? So you started having nation states on the African continent as well, on the Latin American continent. You started having the United States of America. So it really started becoming the organizational structure globally. And this is important to realize, right? Because we're so used to live in a world with nation states that it's difficult to imagine that it wasn't always like that. Previously to the Treaty of Westphalia and to imperialism and colonization, you had a lot of different structures. You had kingdoms, you had other type of conglomerates or nations living together. So it was much more varied and sort of less defined than it was later on when the nation state emerged as the main political structure. And as we said, the nation state was defined by its claim to sovereignty. And this involves two things mainly, right? On the one hand, it involves the ability to engage in collective action internally. So collect taxes, have a national policing system, for example, a national education system. So it involves a lot of internal activities, but it also determines how a nation state can engage externally, right? Engage with other nation states. So it's important in both regards, like in terms of what a nation state can do internally, but also how it interacts with other nation states. However, globalization processes are said to increasingly threaten the power of the nation state, right? So when we look at globalization, there's a lot of theories and a lot of academics that argue that globalization processes are increasingly threatening the power of the nation state. And we're going to look why or how, because there's a lot of different ways in which the nation state is losing power. Now, all these different threats that are sort of threatening the power of the nation state, we can gather them into different categories, right? One of them could be an economic sort of category. And there's several threats in that realm. One major threat that is threatening the nation state is the global economy and the global economic flows, right? We're seeing that more and more nation states are not able to fully control economic flows and the global economy, right? And there's a lot of different examples, like for example, how an economic crisis that might happen in one country or in one region all of a sudden affects big part of the world, right? As a nation state, in our globally and economically connected world, it is very difficult for a country to avoid being hit by those effects as well, even if you're not necessarily sort of part of it directly, right? If Wall Street goes down, the whole world is going to be affected, right? We see it now with the corona crisis as well. Some countries might be less affected in terms of the virus, but they will still be affected by the global economic crisis that will probably follow all of this, right? We're also seeing it, for example, Sweden decided to go quite a liberal way of dealing with coronavirus. So they did not restrict, they did not put many restrictions because they decided that they wanted to keep their economy going as much as possible. However, there's already first reports that say that actually their economy is being hit almost as much as the economy of countries who did do lockdown, because the economy of other countries that they trade with have been hit so much, and because global trade has been hit so much, what one country decides might not have that much power or weight anymore, right? Another example are financial flows, which I've sort of mentioned already with Wall Street, right? It's more and more difficult for nation states to control what flows into the country or out of the country in terms of finances. Also because of the next point, which is the rise of multinational corporations, right? We saw in week 2 that a lot of multinational corporations are wealthier than some nation states, than some small nation states. So obviously it's difficult for a nation state to set condition to a big corporate company that comes into the country and that brings a lot of jobs, right? So there as well, with the rise of multinational corporations in number, but also in power, you have a very important actor that is not the nation state, that is a threat to the power of the nation state. Now, if we look at the second category, we could call it sort of more social criteria that are also threatening the power of the nation state. A big component there, or big criteria, is the migration of people, right? We have more people, more migrants than we've ever had in the world before, and the numbers are increasing. We'll look at it more closely when we talk about migration in week 6. So we'll look at it more in detail, but we have more and more people migrating, and that can be a threat to the nation state, right? And we see in our news pretty much daily that nation states do perceive migration as a very big threat, right? And a lot of countries are struggling to sort of not necessarily keep their borders closed, but to have a controlled migration so that there is not much illegal migration. I'm sure you're aware of the whole crisis in the Mediterranean, with all the migrants that have been drowning because European countries have not been saving them, not letting them into their countries. So migration can be a big destabilizer for a nation state. Also because obviously if you have a lot of migrants coming into your country, they bring a different nationality with them, they bring a different culture, so it's a different influence, right? And it can also cause unrest within your own country because your own people might not necessarily be open to migrants coming into the country. There might be more cultural diversity, so there's a lot of unrest that can come with migration. So it can be a big threat for a nation state. Obviously, apart from all the positives that migration can have, right? We're going to look at that as well in week 6. But for the nation state itself, it's usually not a positive. Another one, a big factor, social factor, are global inequalities, right? We saw in week 2 that global inequalities are rising very rapidly with globalization. We're also going to talk about it more next week when we look at global inequalities. But this is also a factor that can destabilize a nation state a lot, particularly if you have inequality within a nation state as well. And South Africa is a very key example there, with one of the highest inequality rates globally. So that can also cause unrest and is therefore also a big criteria. Another threat to the power of the nation state is the growth of social movements, right? And we're seeing a lot of that right now in the news all over the world. So these can be national social movements that are protesting what is happening in the country politically, maybe a leader staying in power for too long, or new laws being passed that the people don't agree with. There's a million reasons, right? But you also have more and more international social movements, or maybe national social movements that then spark an international response. For example, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it's something that is mainly happening in the US, but that has sparked protest in a lot of other countries as well, where people have been taking the streets as well. And all of a sudden, governments have to deal with those social movements and with people taking the streets, right? A similar one are the environmental protests that we saw mostly last year. that started with Greta Thunberg and then had people taking the streets all over the world, right? And then another very, very big factor is the rise of global problems that require a much more global answer, right? So with globalization, we're seeing that conflicts become more and more global, with more and more countries being involved. Terrorism is something that we're seeing all over. War, the spread of diseases. So there's a lot of global problems that more and more require global answer, right? Particularly international crime, trafficking, be it drug trafficking or human trafficking, is not something that one nation state can solve by itself anymore, because there's so many nation states that are involved in it, and because you have international crime networks that are massive. So all of this basically minimizes the decision-making power that one nation state has by itself. And it requires them to collaborate with other nation states, which obviously takes away power, because all of a sudden, if you're a country, you can't make decisions by yourself anymore. You need to make them together with your neighboring countries, maybe with other countries from the same economic bloc, but you basically need to make those decisions together. Another really important category are environmental threats, right? And this sort of links to what we just said, the rise of global problems. Most environmental problems that we see are more and more global, right? And this forces countries to find more global answers to it. And this also obviously decreases the power of a nation state, right? You can't, as a nation state, you can't control what other nation states are doing, yet their pollution might be affecting you even more. And we're seeing it with climate change, that often the most affected regions in the world are actually not the ones that are contributing to climate change. So you have Western nations that are big contributors, also countries like China that are massive contributors to climate change and to pollution, but they're often not necessarily the ones who are now getting the biggest problems from it. So this is also something that sort of takes away power from a nation state to make decisions for themselves that actually work out. And another big aspect in terms of environment is the looming crisis around oil and around water supplies. Oil and water supplies are becoming less over time, yet we have a growing world population that needs more and more of both. So there is this crisis as well, and in the question how the world will manage those resources. And then there is a last sort of category of factors that are threatening the nation state as well, which we can group under political. And one of them is the growing power of global organizations. We've seen more and more global organizations emerge, be it more political organizations like the UN or the African Union, but also more economic blocs like, for example, BRICS. And also a rise in like international agreements, like, for example, the Paris agreements, that sort of bind nation states to certain agreements, which also means that the nation state itself might have less decision power regarding a specific matter. And then we've also seen a rise, through globalization, a rise in separatist movements within nation states that might want more autonomy for their regions, or that might want to separate completely in order to have their own nation state. That obviously is also a threat to the nation state, because the nation state might lose a part of its territory. So these are just some of the major threats that we're seeing that are sort of that have either emerged because of globalization or that are sort of increased because of globalization. So these are very important to keep in mind. Now, we're gonna discuss this in groups in next week, Wednesday's Q&A, but maybe already stop the video and take some notes for yourself so that you're prepared for the discussion. Question 1, do you agree that the power of nation states is declining? We looked at a lot of reasons that say yes, but then maybe you can find reasons against it. We're also seeing forces that go against it and that are pushing for stronger nation states again. What do you think are dangers or opportunities as well of the nation state losing power? How do you think it is changing the relationship between nation states? And how do you think this is changing the relationship between nation states and other actors like multinational corporations, like social movements, like international organizations, any other actor in international studies? Take a moment to answer them for yourself, and we'll discuss them next week in groups, so we'll debrief on it together. Now, just to sort of close a bit on this part of nation state and relations between nation state, generally there is sort of an agreement on the fact that there is a wide and increasing range of formal and informal political relations between and among nation states that structure global relations. And that this has sort of changed throughout time, right? So during World War II, or at least in the Western world, right? But unfortunately, history mostly focuses on the Western world. During World War II, the major divide was between nation states that were associated with the Allies or the ones that were against the Allies. So you were pretty much either on Hitler's side or on the side of the Allies. So that's pretty much how the relations worked. You had a few countries that were in between, for example, Switzerland. And then you had countries that were left out of the conflict because they were further away or further removed. But this was one of the major sort of patterns during that time, right? Later on, during the Cold War, the major divide was between nation states that were allied with the Soviet Union or nation states that were allied with the West. And this included a much, much bigger part of the world, right? Because even though the Cold War was not an actual war that was fought physically, it was a war for influence, for economic power. And a lot of emerging states, particularly newly independent African states, had to choose sides. They either chose to rather go with the socialist model and to join forces with the Soviet Union, or they chose to go with the West, right? Same in Latin America, same for a lot of small Asian countries, right? So there was a major divide in between nation states, and nation states collaborated on the one side or on the other side. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the global political situation has become more fluid, right? And the USA has pretty much emerged as a hegemonic power until the early 2000s. And there's different theories, right? There's people who argue that the US is still a hegemonic power. Others that are seeing its power decline very rapidly, with losses to China, obviously. But it has been much more diversified, right? It wasn't an either or like during the Cold War, but there's been a rise of different powers, right? And this is really what characterizes the 21st century, is that we see many more powers and we see different power games. And so one could argue that it's more interesting to watch and to try see where global geopolitics are heading. This is just a graph that sort of links to it, because we're talking political power, but obviously political power still, even nowadays, has to do with military power as well, even though a lot of wars are not necessarily fought physically anymore. Military power still is something that can scare off and that can sort of project power. These are you'll see in the column on the left, you'll see the military spendings of the 6 countries that spend the most on military spending. The first number is billions US dollars. So the USA in 2015 spent almost 600 billion US dollars on military equipment, training, weapons, everything that is part of military spending, which is as much as 3.3% of their country's GDP. So that's quite a bit, right? And then you'll see that China, India, Russia, Germany, and Japan together actually, in terms of billions, spend less than the US by itself. And then there's an estimate, which is obviously, well, it was calculated based on certain assumptions, but it's an estimate that was made for a projection for 2030 and how the military spending will increase and how certain countries will increase much more than others. Like you see that China and India have much higher numbers there. We'll have to see if this is a projection that is correct. But you can see there as well how if this really comes to happen like this, how the power is changing there as well, right? In 2015, we clearly see who the military power is. In 2030, the situation looks much more balanced. Now, I promised you a case study, and this is a case study of the Kurdish nation. We'll discuss questions afterwards. I'm just going to play the video.
If you say you're Kurdish, there's a good chance you're from Turkey, or Iraq, or Iran, or Syria, or Armenia. Kurds are spread across 5 different countries, speak 3 different dialects, but they still identify themselves as a distinct ethnic group. So how did this group end up in so many places? Well, Kurds were some of the original inhabitants of this region, what used to be ancient northern Mesopotamia. They lived virtually border-free under the Ottomans until World War I. The winners began to carve up the Ottoman Empire, and the Kurds were promised a separate homeland. But when the borders of modern Turkey and its neighbors were drawn, there was no more talk of an independent Kurdistan. Since then, Kurds have been a minority in every country they live in. One of these countries is Iraq.
لماذا قرر الاستفتاء؟ لأنه فشلت كل المحاولات السابقة.
Iraqi Kurds are constitutionally a part of the country, but they function as a semi-autonomous entity. They have their own parliament and their own armed forces, the Peshmerga, who have been at the forefront of the fight against ISIL. In fact, they've proven to be better fighters than the Iraqi army itself. For example, in 2014, the Iraqi army fled an ISIL attack in Mosul, while Peshmerga fighters stood their ground. Iraq's Kurdish region also occupies parts of the country that are bursting with oil and gas. The Kurds sell these resources pretty much independently of Baghdad. So virtually a state within a state, but with aspirations for a truly independent state separate from Iraq. Naturally, the Iraqi government isn't thrilled.
والله من يعلن عن هذا يتحمل مسؤولية إعلانه. من السهل أن تعلن ما تريد، بس ليس بنفس الدرجة من السهولة أن تطبق ما تريد.
Nor are the other countries with a Kurdish minority.
Yaptığı açıklama bana göre hakikaten çok yanlış bir açıklama. Çünkü bizim yıllardır Irak'ın toprak bütünlüğü konusundaki hassasiyetimizi biliyor.
Even the US, which has so far armed Peshmerga fighters, doesn't want an independent Kurdistan. The fear is a domino effect. A free Kurdistan in Iraq means calls for Kurdish independence in Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Armenia. That could possibly mean redrawing borders, loss of territory, and of course oil revenue, among many other complications. None of these countries want that. They're also afraid that if they give independence to one ethnic minority, demands from others could be next. Meanwhile, the Kurds ask, how is that our problem?
Now, a few questions as usual in relation to the video. I think you should be able to answer them by yourself. Otherwise, just re-watch the video. You'll find most answers, but we can also debrief on them next week, Wednesday, if you would like to. First question, in what way does the Kurdish nationalist separatist movement threaten the nation states of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Armenia? And also, how does that link to the threats that we just looked at before we looked at the case study? Which of all the different threats that we looked at do you see in this specific case study? Another question, more general, what other conflicts were or are based on nation versus nation states? Like, where else do you see conflict like that you can think of? How did colonization shape these conflicts? And this refers back to Westphalia, to the Westphalian Treaty, and to the role of the nation state, right? But it's important to be able to answer these questions. And of course, big one, what is the role of natural resources? Specifically in this case of the Kurdish nation, but also in any other conflict that you were thinking about for question 2. So please take a moment to answer these questions for yourself. Now we're going to move on to the next big part of today's lecture, which is the United Nations. We're going to just have a brief overlook at how the United Nations started, how it works, and what role it has. I'm sure you already know part of these. So the United Nations, and that's why we're looking at it as the first sort of global political structure. It is the most important global political organization, right? Be careful to distinguish between what is a political organization and what is an economic bloc. BRICS, for example, is an economic bloc. NAFTA is an economic, so those are economic collaborations. The United Nations is mostly a political organization, right? It began its operation in 1945, succeeding the failed League of Nations. Now, you probably know that after World War I, many nations, particularly the Allies, came together and decided to create the League of Nations with the main goal to avoid another world war. Then World War II happened, clearly marking the failing of the League of Nations. And in 1945, after the Second World War, the countries that were part of the League of Nations decided to basically give it a second chance, right? And that's where the United Nations were born. It is a state-centric organization, right? And that's a very important thing, because basically it's an organization that is made up of pretty much all the states of the world, right? And we'll look at how different organs of the United Nations work. But this is important because it really is an arena for global decision-making amongst nation states, right? However, the United Nations also can function as an independent actor, particularly the United Nations Security Council. But it is important to keep this in mind, particularly now. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there right now that involve the United Nations. It is important to keep in mind that the United Nations is made up of individuals, nation states, right? And in the General Assembly, they all have a say. So it's more an arena than it is one organization. There's 3 main organs. One is the General Assembly. That's where all the nation states meet. So that's where literally every nation state has its own representative. We have the United Nations Security Council, which we'll look at more in detail just now. The United Nations Security Council mainly deals with international peace and security matters. And then you have the Secretariat, which is basically the administrative side. So that is the part that administers the organization, currently headed by Antonio Guterres, previously by Ban Ki-moon, more back by Kofi Annan. So that's a role that has been changing, right? And then you obviously have all the different United Nations agencies that I'm sure you know many of them, like UNICEF, UNESCO, UNIFEM. So you have UNIDO, UNDP, like there's a lot. Those are agencies that pretty much function as independent UN organizations, but that have a very specific mandate in a specific field, right? So UNICEF works with children, UNESCO works with World Heritage, UNIFEM is centered around women's rights. So each sort of, but those are agencies, right? So they're not part of the main organs. What are the main areas of concern? What does the United Nations do? What is basically the list of tasks? What is the job description? There's basically 4 main areas of concern. The first one is military issues, which is actually more linked to international peace and security, but it often boils down to military issues. So this includes military intervention, peacekeeping missions, disarmament missions, and also election and human rights monitoring. That's one area. A second area are economic issues with the main goal of reducing global inequality and poverty. A third area are environmental issues. And then the fourth area is human protection. So that's basically all the treaties, international agreements, etc., that are involved with regards to human rights and human protection. Now, looking more specifically at the United Nations Security Council, this is important because it's basically the main decision-making body of the United Nations, particularly with regards to peacekeeping and military concerns, right? So the United Nations Security Council, we saw that the General Assembly has a representation of each member state, right? The Security Council only has 15 member states. It has 5 permanent members, which are the United States of America, Russia, France, UK, and China. So pretty much the big powers. Remember, the United Nations were built in 1945. So those ones were pretty much the big powers, sort of the biggest ones back then, right? Those 5 permanent members have a veto power. Now, what does that mean? A veto power is basically sort of a superpower no. So whenever there is a vote on whichever decision is being made, countries that have a veto power, if one country says no, basically if they use their veto to veto a certain decision, then the decision is made, then it's a no. So even if there is a majority in the whole Security Council that would vote yes on it, if one permanent member uses their veto no, then the decision is made and it's a no, right? So this is quite an important, it's a massive power, right? And only those 5 countries have it. Also, just to clarify, veto powers only works with a no. So it doesn't work with a yes. You can't make something happen just because you're the only country voting yes, right? A veto, as the meaning of the word is that as well, is that you can veto a decision. So you can put in a no, and that no counts above everybody else's yeses. So the UN Security Council also has 10 non-permanent members. They serve 2-year terms, and half of them sort of overlap, right? So you have 5 new ones every year, and then so each year 5 change. And they're elected by 2/3 of the General Assembly. So it's the General Assembly that decides which countries get to go into the United Nations Security Council. Usually they try to alternate so that each country, over the years, each country gets a chance. And they also try to more or less balance it out geographically, right? So they generally allocate on a regional basis. Currently, the current 10 non-permanent members are Belgium. Their term was 2019-2020. And then you have the Dominican Republic, also 1920, Estonia 2021. So you see some of them joined in 19 and have a 1920 2-year term. The other ones have a 2021 2-year term. You have Germany, you have Indonesia, Niger, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. South Africa is in the United Nations Security Council. I hope you were aware of that since last year already. Tunisia and Vietnam. So these countries basically make decisions together with regards to peacekeeping missions, with regards to military interventions and so on, together with the 5 permanent members, right? And this obviously means quite a bit of negotiation because you have countries that have a veto power. Now, what's important and quite interesting to know is that resolutions of the Security Council are considered binding international law. The problem, so for example, a peacekeeping mission or whatever other resolution is made in terms of a conflict somewhere is considered binding international law. The problem is there's not really an international court or institution that can actually enforce this, which is often the problem, right? Because it's like you have a rule, but then you have no police to enforce it. So who's going to follow it, right? So that's sort of a bit the thought behind it. And the other thing that is important to know is that the use of military force has obviously been a very contested issue, right? And according to international law, countries are actually only allowed to go to war either in self-defense, so when they have been attacked, or otherwise if authorized by the United Nations Security Council. But there's obviously a lot of conflict with regards to this, because if you look at who dominates the United Nations Security Council, who has more decision-making power than others, right? And how are certain peacekeeping missions decided, how are certain military interventions decided, has often been a very contested issue, right? And so a lot of the criticism that the United Nations has faced and is facing is often related to the role of the United Nations Security Council and to the composition of it. And there have been many countries trying to advocate for a change, either for an abolition of the veto power in general, just saying the Security Council should have just normal members, non-permanent members that each have equal voting rights. Other countries, bigger powers, have been trying to push to receive a veto right themselves and become permanent members themselves, because it obviously gives you quite a bit of power. Obviously, the current 5 permanent members don't have much interest in giving this power to a lot of other countries as well. So that's still an unresolved issue at the moment. And it has been for several years. Your online activity will be on the role of South Africa in the United Nations Security Council, because there were quite a lot of expectations. So you'll have a short video, and you'll also have an article that analyzes the role that South Africa has played a little bit. Now, another important political structure is the African Union, obviously particularly important for African countries. The African Union was constituted at the Lomé Summit in 2000, so it's a rather new institution still. It succeeded to the Organization of African Unity and the African Economic Community. So it was basically sort of a merge of the two. The Organization of African Unity had been created back in 1963 by 30 independent African countries. So if you look at the years, that's very shortly after the first African independencies. So it was created quite early. The African Union currently has 55 member states. And it has a few main objectives, right, that are quite far-reaching if you look at it. So the main objectives of the African Union are to achieve greater unity and to accelerate the political and the socio-economic integration of the continent. So that's quite a Pan-African objective, right? To defend the sovereignty of member states, to advance the role of Africa in the global economy and in global politics, to defend common African positions, and to also encourage international cooperation. Another goal is to promote economic, social, and cultural development on the whole continent. and a further one to promote peace, security, stability, health, research, democratic principles, and human rights on the whole continent. So as you can see, it's quite a mission, right? It's very, very far-reaching objectives that obviously make a lot of sense, but that are also not that easy to achieve. We're going to look at some of the sort of main challenges that the African Union is facing this year, or sort of priorities of the African Union. This is a report that is produced by a private organization every year at the beginning of the year, and it's quite interesting because you can go and read the reports of every year and look at what they consider are the priorities of the African Union in each year, and also how they develop. So this came out at the beginning of the year before Corona became such a big one. I guess if they were to rewrite the report, coronavirus would probably be #1 priority, right? But it is interesting because it gives you an insight into what is happening politically in some of the countries on the continent, right? So here is a list of some priorities that the report establishes. At the bottom, I'll give you the link. So if you're interested, check it out. It's an interesting report. And as I said, you can have it for every year. So you can also compare how things have evolved and how sort of the focus points of the African Union also change depending on what is happening in each country. So one of the priorities is to seek a compromise with the United Nations over co-funding of peace operations. This is something that has been dialogued about for years. To what extent does the African Union fund peace operations on the continent? To what extent does the UN fund it? Who takes on how much? Who provides what? So that's something that is one of the priorities. A second one is to support pivotal elections in Ethiopia and standing ready to mediate in the event of dispute over results. Ethiopia was supposed to have elections now in August that the African Union was supposed to monitor amongst other institutions and actors. Now, because of Corona, the elections have been postponed. It's not clear yet if they're still happening this year or if they're postponed to next year. Another one is deterring leaders in Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea from using constitutional amendments to hold on to power. In both countries, presidents have been in power for 2 terms and are trying to change the constitution in order to be allowed a 3rd term. So in terms of democracy promotion, that's something that is important to the African Union as well, to try avoid that. Helping calm Burkina Faso's insurgency and avert election violence, #4. #5, Cameroon, pressing Yaoundé and separatists towards a more inclusive dialogue to help end the crisis in Cameroon's Anglophone regions. Cameroon still has ongoing crisis between the French and the Anglophone region since, well, dating back to independence basically. #6, pushing the Somali government and regional leaders towards a compromise ahead of Somalia's elections. #7, pressing East African heads of state to step up their efforts to keep South Sudan's peace process on track. And #8, supporting Sudan's transition by offering to act as a guarantor of the deal between the security forces and the civilian leaders. As mentioned here, the link. Now, if you look at the 8 priorities, you will see that some of them are sort of overarching, like for example, #1. So that's really sort of on African Union level. But then there's others that are very country specific, right? Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, a lot of them are usually related to elections, right? Making sure that there's fair elections, making sure that there are elections, and that there is a change of power where a president has been staying all of its terms already. Other interventions are to try prevent violence, to try promote more inclusive dialogues, to keep peace process on track. So that's usually the type of activities that the African Union does, right? So here are sort of the priorities for this year. But every year changes a bit, also depending on who has new elections, where maybe a new conflict has started, things like that. Now, we said that sort of as a third big topic, as a fourth big topic, we would look at the role of human rights, because they also can sort of be considered almost a political structure that does regulate to some extent global politics or how countries function. So before you start, we're not going to discuss it in small groups, although you can if you have someone close by. But just take a moment to think for yourself, and we can discuss this also next week, Wednesday. What role do you think human rights play in political globalization? To what extent are they important? To what extent is it maybe just a piece of paper? How have human rights evolved throughout history? How much do you actually know about human rights? And how have they evolved? How important of a tool do you think they are? And also, how well are human rights doing globally in South Africa? I think particularly that one can be a very big debate topic, also depending on what rights we look at more in detail, right? There's rights that are more economic rights, and there's rights that are more civic rights, which is also a debate that is taking place in quite a lot of countries or areas. Which rights are more important? Is it more important to prevent poverty, which would be an economic right, to provide shelter, to provide people with like basic necessities? But what about civic rights, like the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of movement, all of those, right? And can one compromise the other one or not? We'll look at this also when we look at the role of China in globalization, because China has a very different focus on human rights than what we're used to from the West. So it is an interesting topic as well. Now, if we look at a very brief history of human rights, now this is by no means like complete. There's hundreds, if not more, different human rights charters that have been written throughout history in different places of the world, right? This is just a selection of some of them. For you to also realize that human rights don't just date back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like they date far, far, far more back. So the basically first human rights charter, or it is often considered the first human rights charter, is what we call the Cyrus Cylinder, dated back to approximately 600 before Christ. The Cyrus Cylinder was discovered in 1879 in the ruins of Babylon, and it is by many considered the world's first human rights charter. So basically it's like a clay cylinder. You can Google for pictures, it looks quite cool. It's a clay cylinder that has inscriptions on it that speak of King Cyrus' promotion of religious, racial and linguistic freedom. It's not specifically a declaration of human rights, but it goes in that direction, and the UN continues to promote the cylinder as one of the most ancient declarations of human rights. So this is how far back human rights go. So it's not something recent, right? Some humans at least have always been working on trying to improve human rights for other people. Another important charter that, as you can see, much later, but it is one of the most known ones, is the Magna Carta from 1215 in England, right? And this was under the threat of civil war. King John of England decided to issue the Magna Carta in 1215, declaring the sovereign to be subject to the rule of law and documenting the liberties held by what he called free men. So the Magna Carta basically provided the foundation for individual rights later on in Anglo-American jurisprudence. So this was really sort of a document that sort of listed certain liberties that King John considered free men should be given. Now you'll notice that free men, first of all, does not include women. It also does not include any type of not free men or immigrants or slaves or anything, right? So just keep that in mind. Slightly later, but around the same time, but in a completely different part of the world, was the Manden Charter. It's also 13th century. This is also one of the oldest, actually, constitution more than human rights charters in the world, and it was proclaimed by the founder of the Mandingo Empire, so in today Mali. And it advocated social peace in diversity. It advocated the inviolability of the human being, education, the integrity of the motherland, food security, the abolition of slavery, and freedom of expression and trade. So if you Google it, it's quite interesting. It's also a very old charter, dated back to the 13th century, but it already holds a lot of the ideas that later on became part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it also, particularly the inviolability of the human being. So the fact that the human being should and cannot be violated is a concept that is very important in human rights, and that was already in this charter back in the 13th century in the Mandingo Empire. Now moving on throughout history, we're jumping here. We're not looking at all the declarations, obviously. These are it's literally a selection of a few important ones from different parts of the world. This is another important one. It's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from 1789. So this is after the French Revolution. And it's also one of the basic charters of human liberties. So it contains the principles that inspired the French Revolution. And it was adopted in 1789 by France's National Assembly. And it also inspired later charters. So it is also one of the charters that laid quite important foundations. Here as well, it was the rights of men and it was the rights of French men, right? So not the rights of everybody. And then comes in so more than 150 years later, comes what we today know as the most important Declaration of Human Rights, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, dated 1948. What is interesting to know about this one, apart from it being the Declaration of Human Rights, it was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds. So there were a lot of aspects that flew into this, that led into this declaration. And it was then proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly as a common and universal standards for all people and all nations. And it has been translated into over 500 languages. So it is often said that or criticized that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a very Western concept. But actually it was drafted with representatives from very different backgrounds, trying to sort of incorporate many different perspectives. And there were also, it was also based on a lot of the previous charters, trying to incorporate different things. What is new about this one in comparison to the previous one? It's that it is universal. So it is for all people of all nations. And it is the first one that does that. Now, another important convention of human rights is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly. It's important because it's basically the International Bill of Rights for Women, and it is the first one in its kind that is international. As you can see, it's not as old as we would maybe like it to be. What it does, it basically sets up an agenda for national action to end discrimination against women. And by accepting the convention, the member states commit to undertake measures to end discrimination against women in all forms in their own countries. So it is a very important convention, particularly for women, although not as far-reaching as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which obviously also incorporates women. But this one is very specific, also to sort of counter the different types of violence and discrimination that women face. So it's an important charter that you will come across. Another important charter, particularly since we're talking about the African Union and being on the African continent, is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, adopted in 1981. This charter is also known as Banjul Charter, and it is also an international human rights instrument. So it's very similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it is a specifically African charter adopted by the African Commission on Humans and People's Rights. So it is an instrument that promotes and protects human rights and basic freedoms on the African continent. And it is overseen by the African Commission on Humans and People's Rights that is based in Banjul. That's why it's often also called the Banjul Charter. What is interesting about this charter is that it doesn't only state the different rights, it also states duties of the people to protect their communities and so on. So it's quite interesting because I think it's one of the few charters that actually doesn't only focus on rights, but also addresses responsibilities or like civic responsibilities. So that's quite an interesting part of it. Now, moving on very quickly, straight into the next topic. Where is global governance headed? Now, we looked at the role of the nation state. We looked at different threats that the nation state is experiencing, how it's losing its power. We've looked at the United Nations, at the African Union, and at human rights as a bit of a broader topic. Now, if we look at global governance, is really, if you wonder what it actually means, the word really tells it, right? It's really sort of how is governance being done, or how is it changing globally, right? We're used to national governments, but there's more and more decision making that is also done globally. And that's pretty much what we understand by global governance, right? So it's who is doing the governance globally, basically, putting it into very simple words. Now, we were saying that we have a declining power of the nation state, right? But at the same time, we still have limitations of intergovernmental organizations as well. So you basically have nation states, governments that are losing power or that are more powerless in the face of the current global challenges. But at the same time, intergovernmental organizations like the UN, like the African Union, are still quite limited in what they can really achieve, right? So it's not like the UN can decide and dictate to everybody in the world what they can and cannot do, right? We don't have a global government like that. So with those two conditions set, we're seeing an emergence of a variety of actors and forms of global governance, right? We spoke about it in lecture 1, I think, as well. We have more and more important participation from part of multinational corporations, social movement, other communication networks. So there's more and more players that play a role, and therefore global governance is becoming sort of more complex because you have many actors that have their influence. And so you have more and more forms of global governance. Here are some new forms that have sort of emerged in the past maybe decade. One is multi-stakeholder initiatives. So these are kind of initiatives where you have public policy networks, you have international NGOs, you have private sector organizations that work together, right? You have private-public initiatives. So these are initiatives that have different stakeholders from very different areas that somehow work together to provide a certain service or set certain standards. This is something that we're seeing in a lot of different fields that is sort of increasing, sometimes because of a lack of government initiatives. You might have different collaborations that just decide to basically provide that service. You also have more and more voluntary regulations, which can sound funny, but these are basically regulations or associations that basically come together to set certain standards. For example, the Global Compact, it was launched by the United Nations, but it's basically a set of regulations for multinational corporations that multinational corporations can decide to sort of join or be part of voluntarily. So voluntarily, certain multinational corporations are going to say, okay, you know what, we're going to stick to these and these environmental and labor law rules in order to have a more positive impact in this world in terms of environment, in terms of community, in terms of labor. So we voluntarily stick to these regulations. So it's sort of standards that are set that different actors decide to join voluntarily. And then another new form of global governance are transnational arbitration bodies, which are basically info courts. So it's like an alternative court, sort of. So these are just some forms, right, that are sort of emerging out of new collaborations, out of new needs. But what we're seeing is that there is a trend towards more global structures or structures that are more truly global, and also the involvement of more diverse actors, right? Whether this is for the good or for the bad is another question, and probably we'll only see over time. But that's sort of the trends that we're seeing in terms of global governance. Now, last but not least, we're going to look at another really important actor in political globalization, which is civil society. So basically us, the people, right? And how we have mobilized, how we have organized, and how we have also taken advantage of globalization or made use of globalization or certain parts of it to mobilize more. This is a very brief clip. It's an extract from a clip from the World Economic Forum that speaks to civil society. So I'll just quickly show it to you and then we'll move on from there.
Today, the challenges are just enormous. We know that a fractured society will not be good for growth, will not be good for sustainable development. We need better equality, better democracy. We cannot rely on the idea that technology will solve everything.
Vast parts of populations have been left behind.
This is not a world that we want. We don't want it for ourselves, and we don't want it for our children and grandchildren.
Digital transformation creates tremendous opportunities, but it also creates challenges. We're constantly dealing with the changes that wields for our society. Who has power, who doesn't, who has voice and who doesn't.
Civil society has an immense amount to offer to ensure that the technologies are implemented in a way consistent with broader societal goals.
Technology should be in the service of human beings, in the service of values, in the service of families.
Jobs will be destroyed and new types of jobs will be created, but 90% of the new jobs in the digital economy are very low remunerated and very low protected.
People are losing trust in each other. How do we bring credibility back to the conversation?
There's a tendency to think the market can solve these things, but the practical reality is for very low-income families, the market doesn't work very well. And so our focus now is how do we make the market work for the disenfranchised?
Civil society is embedded in communities, working with some of the most vulnerable groups around the world.
We are the citizens that participate in decisions and that should be aware and willing and committed to defend civil rights, human rights.
There are some very, very good examples of people using technology for democratic purposes. It's not whether people are keeping up, it's whether we are thoughtful about shaping a future where people matter.
Civil society plays an incredibly important role in holding governments to account.
It really is a way of bringing the voice of the community and the residents that we're trying to serve into those conversations.
These are just a few comments, right? But I think it speaks to many aspects of civil society. So maybe if it was a bit quick, have a look at it another time, or like a second time, because it does speak to a lot of aspects and a lot of roles of civil society, and also challenges that civil society faces. Now, questions to ask ourselves is, what is the role of civil society, and how has this role changed with globalization? And also, what are mechanisms of participation for civil society, right? We can discuss it as well in our Q&A next week, but to give it a head start, mostly the role of civil society, and I'll go to the next slide because it basically shows it, or this is how it's often understood at least. Civil society is all of us, right? So society and civil society should actually not be this far apart. What is often perceived is that civil society is sort of the active part of society, the part of the people who really are demanding for more rights, or who are participating in civic ways, sort of who are using their civic rights and their civic participation to create change. So often civil society stands as a counterbalance to the state and also to the economic market, right? So often civil society is, or usually it's the one holding governments and parliament accountable. It's usually the ones who protest if multinational corporations are, I don't know, violating labor rights, or are polluting more than what they're allowed to. So all of those kind of things, it's usually civil society, or civil society organizations, NGOs. Like there's a lot of different types of forms of organization that can come out of civil society, right? But I think this graph kind of shows, right, how civil society, or the active part of society, can be sort of almost a bridge that sort of looks at what is not going well, and holds government and corporates and international organizations accountable. Generally, there is a very strong development towards a more global civil society that is non-governmental, diverse, interlinked, and committed to promote social justice and environmental protection on a global level. I think we've seen quite a lot of different movements in recent years that have become very global. For example, the Me Too movement that has been picked up in a lot of different countries. Currently, we have the Black Lives Matter movement that has also picked up in a lot of countries. Last year, we had a lot of environmental protests going on everywhere in the world. So this just shows how civil society is also more connected amongst countries, and how also obviously technology helps to make certain protests or certain actions more global. Now, civil society, what we need to not forget is that this is not just about protesting, right? There's many different ways in which civil society can be active, be it through working with local government, through petition, through public pressure groups. There's a lot of awareness raising that is done by civil society groups. So there's a lot of different ways, right? There's a lot of community actions as well that are led by civil society. So it's not all just about protest. There's a lot of other actions that are taken as well, even in terms of lawmaking or proposing policies, being part of elaborating policies. So civil society is active, or can be active, in all of those spheres. Going back to the questions, I think we've answered the first one. And the second one, how has the role changed? As we said, it has become more global. On the one hand, because civil society is more connected globally. On the other hand, also because many problems are more global and cannot be addressed by the civil society in one country alone. For example, if we look at human trafficking, it's not enough if civil society in one country tries to do something against it. It's going to be much more effective if several countries, or the civil society in many countries, work together. And we're obviously also seeing that sometimes for civil society, seeing that people in another country are active around a specific issue makes you recognize that that issue is present in your own country as well. So it can also sort of spark and much quicker. What are mechanisms of participation for civil society? We mentioned some. Obviously, in terms of global civil society, social media and any type of technology has been absolutely crucial in terms of organizing, in terms of also adding numbers, right? There's a lot of global petitions that are happening now where anyone around the world can sign the petition to add your voice to a specific petition or claim, or there's much more awareness campaigns that are happening all around the world that we have access to because of the internet. So there's a lot of different mechanisms of participation that are happening and that often overlap. And some of them might be more international, some of them might be more national or even more local. So these are just some thoughts around the role of civil society in globalization. Now we've come to the end of the lecture content of today's lecture, but I want to quickly give you some information about assignment 1 that we said is due next week, Thursday, 10th September, before midnight. So make sure you submit on time. Also make sure you don't submit in the last 5 minutes because it's very likely that the system will be jammed and it might not accept your submission. So just make sure, and also now with load shedding, with internet connectivity issue and everything that we're experiencing, I think it's wise to submit latest a few hours before that. Make your submission for the IIE people, make it on SafeAssign. You should find it, it should be directly accessible. If you struggle, let me know. The Monash people, please submit on Turnitin and on Moodle, just in case, because sometimes one of the two doesn't go through. And so if we have it on both, we know that at least one of the two is going to be fine. Content of this assignment is everything that we've seen up to here, plus also your activity for week 4. So it's really everything that we've done so far. So it's week 1, introduction to globalization, week 2, economic globalization, week 3, cultural globalization, week 4, political globalization. Make sure you really listen to the lectures if you haven't done yet. Make sure you review the slides, you read the chapters of the books of the book that are sort of the basis for the content. There's also some lectures that were based on other articles that you find under the different weeks on Learn and on Moodle. So make sure you read up on all of that, you take notes and you have your things ready. Make sure you also review the activities that we did in each week and the questions that we discussed in the Q&A sessions every week. Now, the structure of the assignment, usually this is a take-home, usually this is a sit-in exam. This year, because of Corona, it has turned into a take-home exam and / assignment, but it really has more or less the structure of an exam, right? So there is a first half of 6 questions, questions 1.1 till 1.6, that accounts for half of the marks, for 50 marks. So it's 6 short paragraph answers. So in this section, all the questions need to be answered, right? Some questions are 10-mark questions, some of them are 5-mark questions. So make sure you watch out for that. For the 10-mark question, make sure you use between 100 and 150 words. For the 5-mark questions, between 50 and 80 words. Please stick to the word count. I'm gonna deduct if you have answers that are double the length, right? Because it is also important that you learn to be detailed, but to also be concise. So to not talk around issues, but to be very clear. And because it is a take-home exam and you actually have time for it, not just the 2 hours of an exam, you can review and work on your answers. So make sure they're properly structured, even if it's short answers. Make sure you're within the word count, and make sure you provide detailed information and that you really answer what is asked. The second part for the other 50 marks is question 2. That's an essay. You have 4 questions there. Choose one essay question. So you only answer one, whichever one you prefer. And you write an essay of about 800 to 1,000 words. Now here as well, make sure it is well structured. Make sure it has a lot of information. Make sure it looks at all the different sides of the question or of the argument, and that it really follows an essay structure. So it should have an introduction, a body that has different arguments and counter arguments and evidence and facts, and then it should have a conclusion that summarizes it, right? Here as well, stick to the word count. For part 1, for questions 1.1 till 1.6, you don't have to reference your answers. For your essay, you also don't really have to reference, because as we said, this is a take-home exam and most of your content will be based on the lectures and on the slides, so there's not that much you can reference. If you use specific numbers or facts or quotes or opinions, then you have to reference. Then you have to say, according to so-and-so, this and this, right? So just also use a bit of your own judgment as to what you think really needs referencing and what you've taken from the slides and you just feel like, yeah, it's what we discussed. Now, last but not least, a few helpful tips for your first assignment. And I know some of these may seem very obvious, but experience shows that they're not. So number 1, read each question properly and make sure you answer the full question. So all aspects of it. This is a really important one. This is where people lose the most of points. So for example, if the question is explain the theories of cultural hybridization and cultural convergence, and give examples of it and explain how they contradict, or I don't know, I'm making this up, but for example, there's several aspects to the question. You first have to explain the 2 different theories, you have to give examples, and then you have to compare them, right? So there's 3 aspects of it. This is just an example, but make sure that you really answer all of it, right? And not just the first part of it. Make sure, again, to submit timely, avoid last-minute submissions. I'm not going to accept blaming technology if it's last minute, right? If you really have problems submitting, send me an email previously, before submission time, okay? And let me know if there's really something wrong, okay? If you really don't manage to submit, email me your assignment. If you can avoid emailing me, please do so, because otherwise I'm going to end up with a million emails. But as a last resort, that's also an option, just to show that you had it ready, okay? Also, make sure you structure your argument, that you provide detailed information, but that you also respect the word count. Because this is a take-home exam and you have time to work on it, you have time to rewrite your answers, to review them, to make them shorter, to adapt them. So make sure you submit something that is really well written, also for the short questions, and that contains a lot of information, but that respects the word count, okay? So because it is a take-home exam, we do expect a higher level of information, because you have access to everything. So you need to obviously provide, like, the bar is higher than if it was a sit-in exam where you only have 2 hours and you don't have access to anything, okay? So make sure you really work on your answers. Make sure you explain, you discuss, you analyze. A simple definition is usually not enough. It depends on the question, right? So also make sure that you really do what you're asked for. If it asks for define cultural hybridization, I'm going to stick with that example, define cultural hybridization, then you only have to define it. But if it says analyze or discuss cultural globalization or cultural hybridization and its role in cultural globalization or something like that, then you have to go much deeper. Then you have to explain the concept, but you also have to analyze and discuss it, right? And make sure you don't waste half of your word count on a definition, because the focus should be on discussing or analyzing or explaining. Make sure you provide relevant examples, not any type of example. So make sure you really use examples that work for the specific case that you're making. Try use own examples as well, not just the ones that we looked at in the lecture. If you have own examples, that's even better, because it shows that you've made it your own and that you truly understood. For the essay question, so for the second part, as said before, make sure you structure it well. It should have an introduction, a body that is logically structured, and it should have a conclusion. Make sure you support your arguments with evidence, with facts, and make sure you also address counter arguments. So don't just take your position. Make sure you sort of try to look at all at the topic or at the issue from all different sides, and that you sort of don't just focus on one side of the argument. I think that's it. That's the most important ones. Also, there's no specific sort of technical or like formatting requirements, but submit something that looks good. Like it doesn't have to be super fancy, but make sure it has a title, make sure it has your name, your student number, make sure your pages are numbered, make sure you number your questions properly so it's easy to see, that you have a decent font, that you have a decent spacing. Just make sure that it looks good, right? Because that's always important, no matter what, even if it's not necessarily graded or marked. Something that looks good and is easily readable already makes a much better impression, right? And that's for everything that you ever submit throughout your whole career. Okay, that's it. If you have questions, doubts, check the slides and the readings before, and also read the different emails and communications in your forums. Ask your classmates, discuss with your classmates, ask your peeps in your Zoom chat. Like do your part first. If you have questions, then you're welcome to email me. We also still have time next week, Wednesday, in the consultation after the Zoom call. So let me know if you have doubts, but make sure you've done your work before you ask me what cultural hybridization is, okay? And then, yeah, good luck and good work. Next week, as we said, Wednesday, the Q&A session on Zoom about this week, about week 4. And after that, consultation for any type of questions that you have about the assignment. And then next week's lecture is going to be on global humanitarianism and inequalities, which is a really interesting topic as well. Readings for the lecture is book chapters 13 and 14. And as we said, next week, Thursday, the submission of your assignment 1. That's it. I hope you have a good afternoon or evening or whatever it is when you're watching this. And I'll see you next week.